welcome back to the Connect with HSPC, the Health and Suicide Prevention Coalition's continuing efforts to get suicide prevention education and awareness out into the community through our podcast or our webcasts. I'm going to start with a territory acknowledgement, and then I'll introduce our guests. So I believe, Dara, are you in Oakville today?
Yes.
Okay, so Dara and I are on Treaty 22 of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and work very closely with the Mississaugas. And I have been taught and have the privilege of working with the chief and some of their elders and their knowledge holders. And I've been taught in working with them over the years that land acknowledgement, or territorial acknowledgement, is really a personal thing, and it really should reflect thoughts about the land. So first I want to thank the Mississaugas on Treaty 22 for being the rightful treaty owners of Treaty 22, this piece of land in Oakville. And I'd also like to thank Mother Earth. Thinking about today, driving in on a beautiful morning with the sun just coming up, it was beautiful and big and orange this morning. And I want to thank Mother Earth for the work that she's done over the past several months to bring us snow and winter and cold that protects the earth and protects the animals and the plants and the insects over winter. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Mother Earth for giving us some warmer winds. I don't know what's going to happen today at the end of today. It's supposed to be winter again, but I am certainly seeing a lot of the snow melting through the winds and through some of the sun coming out and some of the warmer temperatures happening in our world. And so it really does remind me and make me pay attention to, the original teachers and the original First Nations of our land, the plants, the trees, the water, the air. So I'd like to acknowledge Mother Earth today as we continue our conversation on suicide prevention. So with me today is my co-host or co-interviewer, Dara from the Stress Center of Halton. Thanks again, Dara, for helping me out with this one.
A pleasure to be here, Marcus.
And I am super excited to be able to introduce and have a conversation with a very good friend of mine, actually, Rami Shami, who I met several years ago, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. Rami does work, and still does work with the Lighthouse for Grieving Children. And I met him through one of the conferences that they put on children's grief. And I was selected to be his presentation buddy to help him during his presentation. And I happened to get into one of his, it was the Weave of Community session that he was presenting around grief and children's grief. And from that moment on, we kind of dressed the same almost. So I knew exactly that we were going to be friends and that it sparked right away. We both had shirts on and a vest, and Rami, you probably had your famous suspenders on, but I didn't have suspenders. Anyway, we've grown from there, and Rami and I trade back and forth, being presentation buddies at different conferences. Rami's taught me a lot about cultural humility and about trauma-informed and resiliency. And so we're really, really excited to have Rami here today with us. And so welcome, sir. It is a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm really looking forward to having this conversation around suicide education, suicide prevention, and postvention from the lenses that you are, I'm not going to say expert, because you'll say I'm not the expert, but certainly look up to you in lots of ways. But in your work, and you can tell us a little bit about your work around that cultural humility piece, the resiliency, the trauma, right? The things that you're seeing in the work that you do, and how we can educate our viewers and get them to understand those kind of pieces when we talk about suicide prevention here in Halton. So welcome, Rami. If you want to introduce yourself and give us a little bit, or give us a lot, as much as you want, your background, what you're doing now, where you come from. I'm going to give you the podium, sir.
From where to where, Marcus? I mean, who knew when I was wearing that flower shirt and you were wearing a lovely vest. And I said, that gentleman, that man, there's a vibe about you that I needed to get to know you. And I knew we'd work together. I knew we'd talk together. I knew we'd become friends. And really nothing is like sitting with you and having, a beverage and talking about life, right? Because all of this are aspects of our living. And unfortunately, they often live in the recesses of our phobias, of our discrimination, of our, fear and apprehensions of the vulnerability and susceptibility that the topic and the subject matter really presents. And I'm excited to have met Dara now because I've heard great things from Marcus about yourself. So yeah, there are no experts in this field because the expertise is personal. We are experts in many ways of our own lives. And I very much thank the opportunity because this is not a topic I talk too much about, but I find my entire life has intersected and come together to be in this synchronicity of this podcast. And what I really mean by that is that, and maybe I'll just start from the beginning, right? I mean, my parents are settlers on this great land, and they came from war-torn countries of Israel and Lebanon. And they came here as refugees and immigrants. My father was a refugee and my mother was an immigrant. But the challenge of being in war, right, and experiencing war, is that they probably suffered from a lot of what's called, you folks know, post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress syndrome. So my childhood was anything but easy, right? I experienced a lot of what's called childhood developmental trauma. My father, unfortunately, and I've made peace with it because of the lifestyle and where he came from, was quite abusive, right? And unfortunately, I experienced a lot of that abuse, which caused a lot of traumatization in my regard. And then you add a name like Rami Shami, and you add a upper middle class, predominantly white, social community background. And then you throw in a unibrow, well, then you could just see how tough my childhood was. I was bullied a lot. I was abused at home. I was bullied at school. I was discriminated against. I experienced so much racism and being beaten up. So it impacted me. It impacted me a great deal, right into my 30s and 40s. And why that's really impactful for me now is because I recognized what I did to escape those experiences. And and just point blank, my number one go-to was thinking of killing myself. Really, my number one go-to, my escape was suicidality. It wasn't to end the suffering. It wasn't to end. I mean, so I got right into it. I mean, I've been primed and ready to talk about this since we talked about it, Marcus and Dara. So I'll talk about
That's
what I do
great.
for a living in a second, right? But I just
Yeah,
got
but
right.
Rami, part of what we do at Suicide Prevention Coalition is to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, silence is not the way to combat this social problem. So,
Yeah, no doubt,
so thank
Marcus.
you.
So my escape wasn't so much an escape from suffering and pain. I wasn't depressed. What for me, the escape was I've recognized what I've recognized now is as a form of trauma-informed approach is the fact that I had the choice. I had the power. Okay. I had the control. I had the autonomy to do what I wanted to do, which was to get out of it. And the only way I could get out of it was to take my own life. I remember as a 7-year-old coming home one day after I was brutally beaten up and discriminated against and bullied at school. And my dad was in a bad mood and he was, fuck this and fuck that, in Arabic, of course, which sounds a lot more colorful than it is in English. The F word in Arabic is way better than in English, okay? And I remember holding a butter knife to my heart and saying, all I got to do, and I remember saying it to myself, I said, they can't take this away from me. All I got to do is push this in. And the feeling wasn't, again, to end the suffering. The feeling was that I had control. And so later on in life, and what I teach now and what I do now, I mean, I work in hospice palliative care. I've worked in hospice palliative care since I was 19 years old. I love the shit out of this work, right? Death, dying, trauma, grief, and bereavement is my jam. It's my thing. And it isn't because of a reflection of my childhood. It's because of the if I may use this term, the beautiful nature of presence, of being with death and dying, that authenticity of that moment of being with people living with a progressive life-limiting illness. There's nothing like it in my life. And I do a lot, as you mentioned, Dara. I rock climb and I mountain bike and I take my kid on crazy adventures. But this is the shit. This is it. Okay. So what I recognize now, after 35 years in hospice palliative care, and learning about 3 or 4 years ago about a trauma-informed practices, which includes the principles of empowerment, which includes the principles of control and choice and trust, and the aspects of what we'll speak about a little bit is culture humility, is that I was trying to empower myself through suicidality. Then I realized and studied in my studies, in my personal studies, and I tried some formal education, trauma informed, but I found them so not progressive, and even at the university level, that I went back to my self-study. It's this fact that there are tension-reducing behaviors that we exhibit to release the tension caused by traumatization. I realized my childhood and even into my adulthood, there was a lot of trauma, right? And then that traumatization, my escape from that traumatization was suicidality. That was my tension-reducing behavior. So in effect, what I was doing is trying and applying trauma-informed principles, tried, tested, and true, and researched and stated today by some phenomenal people, like Dr. Gabor Mate and Dr. Peter Levine and Dr. Bruce Perry. But I applied it as a child and as a teenager to empower myself and give myself choice through this tension-reducing behavior of suicidality. The challenge with that, Marcus and Dara, is once you talk about suicide, right away there's an association with downness and depression and hopelessness and helplessness, and maybe not, helplessness is an empowering piece. And that there's, obviously aspects of mental health, but I feel this piece is missing. I really feel when we talk about, or at least in my avenues of suicidality, is this piece of it being a tension-reducing behavior, of it being a piece of trying to empower and create choice and control in situations is missing. And that's why a lot of us stay silent. That's why I stayed silent for many years, because I didn't want people to think that I was depressed. No, I was just trying to empower myself, maybe in this avenue that would have caused a lot of self-harm and harm to others. But that's what I knew, right? And I think if we want to relate that to suicide prevention, I think we have to look at it from a trauma-informed angle. I think we have to look at it from an angle that we look upstream. Where are the aspects of traumatization that somebody might be, thinking of suicidality or suicidal ideation in order to gain a sense of empowerment, choice, and control? Because that was my childhood. I was like, hey, you could do anything to me, but you can't control this. If I choose, I'll take my own life, because then you can't take that away from me. And if I can, I'm on a run, so just give me 30 seconds more, okay?
It's all good.
And if I told
That's
you,
what you're here for.
And if I could add another piece to that, okay, this is the aspects of culture humility. I've been practicing. I was actually teaching at Bethel Hospice yesterday, culture humility. They brought me in to do that, which was an amazing, amazing hospice. There's this aspect of culture humility. And in culture humility, that's a concept that we all have an individual personal culture. And my individual personal culture is hospice palliative care and the principles of hospice palliative care, but it's also my experiences of traumatization. There's an aspect of diversity that's often missed and silenced, and that's trauma, right? And that's in one of the aspects of diversity that I speak to is traumatization. Now, in that, this concept of culture humility, this piece of personal culture of who and what I am, is an important expression of my entire life story. So just to relate that back to my childhood, when I was in suicidal ideation, when I was in thoughts of suicide, I'd fantasize about, this happened even into my adulthood, into my 30s. My father didn't stop being abusive until I stopped talking to him. This aspect of suicide, I would fantasize about my funeral. And what I would fantasize about the funeral, not that people came and loved me and they cared for me. No, it was that my true sense and identity would be expressed at my funeral, meaning I would be seen, I'd be heard, who I am, this aspect of my personal culture. And so that aspect of even the suicidality came out in how I fantasized about my funeral and how people would see me for who I am. Because for many years, the aspects of traumatization was that my identity was lost. You're too sensitive, you're too feminine, however my family, especially from a Middle Eastern culture, thought of femininity and masculinity, right? And I wasn't masculine enough because I didn't hunt and kill things, right? And so it dismissed a lot of who I was. that led to aspects of suicidality, that led to aspects of personal culture that I would imagine at my own funeral. I think that's a good start.
It's an amazing start.
Yeah, Rami, you mentioned your work. Can you just give us a quick
Oh, of
synopsis?
course.
I mean,
Yeah.
you have a phenomenal career in a certain sector of palliative care, so it's an interesting point to bring into this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely, Marcus. Thank you for that. I get carried away for things. What I do for a living, I work in hospice palliative care. So I work currently as a case manager for Kensington Health. I provide the bereavement support for our 19-bed hospice residents and for our community program, as well as some dabbling in the long-term care. And I also provide caregiver support. But I also work for Lighthouse for Grieving Children. I run their podcast, and as a community advisor, evolved from a multicultural outreach coordinator. But really, my passion is teaching and education. I take anything I churn at the bedside or in children's grief or in bereavement and caregiver support, and I share it. So I teach a lot across Canada and in the US and down into Trinidad as a consultant in hospice palliative care. And really, Dara, I lucked into this, whether you call it grace or luck or synchronicity. I was 19 years old looking through the Mississauga News. Remember the Mississauga News, the actual paper copy? And there was a full page ad back with Hospice Peel that said, do you want to sit with the terminally ill? We used to address people as terminally ill back then, 35 years ago. And I said, hell yeah, this is what I want to do. There was a vibe and a resonance and a synchronicity that just was unmistakable. So yeah, 35 years later, here we are.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, I have to say, I listened to a few of your podcasts and your dedication, and it's as if you had a calling from 19 when you saw the Mississauga News. But to go back to your childhood, the trauma and the abuse and being bullied, was there any pivotal moments when someone did believe in you as you struggled to find your identity and influenced you in your life, or believed in you, or any pillars of influence that inspired and encouraged you to be where you are today? Because as we look back at your start in life to where you are now, it's just incredible that you're helping out so many people. So were there any influential people that helped guide you?
Dara, I appreciate that question, but they're too numerous to mention. There's this whole definition, and you folks know this whole definition of family, right?
Yeah.
And my family was not, I don't consider my family necessarily blood, really. There's been too numerous. Now, I'll start. I remember one of the most pivotal moments was meeting the inimicable, the incredible Ms. June Caldwood, the late Miss June Caldwood.
Okay.
I don't know, folks, yeah, right. I met her and I remember her making fun of my name and this and that, but she held me in such a moment of presence. Like she saw all of me. And I was like, I want more of that. That shit is good. I want to feel that. And I want to do that with others, right? I want to hold them in that embrace. And I think, Dara, that was one of the moments where my life shifted. I said, and it was very early in my career as a hospice volunteer before I stepped into, to be actually paid for it. And I said, I want more of that. So that was number one. And then along the way, there's been some incredible people that have guided me. Linda Johnson, Dee Kearns, Carol Latour, Christine Gagnon. There's been so many that have been supported me along the way to teach me, to share with me, to provide me with knowledge. And then, for the most part, Dara, if I can say, it's the people that I serve, right? That was my not my refuge, but it resonated with who I was at home, right? At my home or at school. If you weren't macho, if you weren't overly masculine, I mean, I was spat on by my dad. I was sworn at. I was called so many names by people in the community. And here was hospice where I could be me. I could be myself. So it wasn't the attraction, especially with my contemplation of suicide, it wasn't my attraction to death and dying that drew me to it, which is what people think most of the time. It was the actual presence that I had that moment with June Caldwood that left an echo with me that's lasted 30 years. And if I could add some more aspects to that and currently my incredible partner, Natalie Prue, who works a lot in this field in grief and bereavement and suicide prevention and what have you, and children loss and miscarriages and what have you, that has really served as my sounding board, and has helped me crisscross those paths in my life to bring me to where I am today. But going back to that, basically I could count almost every person I've served to be one of those people that have helped me to be where I am today.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that and serving. I loved how you had said it's the utopia of serving all. That's your motto. So
yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, absolutely right. There is a utopia to it. There's a beauty to it. There's a freedom in it, a freedom of self-expression. Yeah. And so that's where I found my niche, and that's what's kept me going.
Well, thank you for all that you do, because you clearly work totally from your heart.
Oh, thank you, Daria. I appreciate it. Thank you for all you folks do. It's an imperative field that you work in.
Mm-hmm. Marcus, I think you had a question? Because we'll keep interrupt, please.
Yeah, no problem. So I want to talk a little bit about, Rami, about your resiliency, or just resiliency in general around people that might be watching this, or people that are supporting youth and families and adults in suicide ideation. Like, what does resiliency look like? What does it like? Where did you find it? 30 years in this industry with past trauma and the suicide ideation that you had. Where's your resiliency come from?
Yeah. If I may modify that term, resiliency has gained such a popularity now that it's almost lost its potency, right? I like the term self-compassion. I really, really resonate with the term self-compassion. And where things started to really shift for me, Marcus, honestly, is when I discovered, or not, I shouldn't say discovered, sorry, I was taught cultural humility. Because that concept, these two concepts, that's why I'm excited to speak to you folks today and share this knowledge. These two concepts of trauma-informed approach and cultural humility really intersect with what we would call resiliency, right? And how does self-compassion feel into that? Well, the whole aspect of self-compassion was, for me, birthed from cultural humility, because in identifying with a personal culture that was mine, was who I am. Sensitive, caring, compassionate. I'm not trying to blow my own horn, but you can't be in this field for 30 years without having some of that, right? There's no mastery to it. There's no expertise to it. It's just a kindness and a compassion and a love for people and a love for the work and a sense of presence. That's who I was. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, in my biological family and my, the community that I lived in and the Lebanese, for the most part, the Lebanese community, that wasn't seen as appropriate by a man. Right, by a male. And so I felt a sense of rebirth when I discovered hospice, when I discovered culture humility and personal culture, because I say, hey, wait a minute, this is who I am. I don't like falafel. I fucking hate hummus, right? I don't like hockey, okay? I don't have any real relations with the Lebanese community or Lebanon. But I love hospice. This is who I am. I don't shoot birds and kill animals. I'm not a hunter, as my father and my brother, boast. I'm just not into that shit. This is who I am. And hospice obviously was that avenue. And culture humility proved it. It said it's okay to have a personal culture. It's okay to have a culture that's yours, an expression of yourself. And then as I delved into working with structural vulnerability and homelessness within there's this hospice that I helped open called Journey Home Hospice, and working with this trauma-informed approach where it used those principles of choice and autonomy and self-expression, right, and empowerment. Well, that intersected with culture humility, and then I was off to the races. I said, I can be me, right? I can be what I was. See, something we teach a lot in the social sector and healthcare and volunteerism is boundaries, but we don't really teach it, right? We don't talk about trauma. We don't talk about culture humility. We don't talk about personal culture. And so we get all these boundaries, and we wonder why people cross them. Because there's instant that self-awareness of personal culture and the aspects of traumatization. And from all that started to churn and potentize and really succuss this aspect of self-compassion, because then I started to feel compassion for myself. I started to feel compassion for the trauma I'd experienced. It was identified. I could put my finger on it. I could see how I was being, dismissed and silenced in who I was in my self-expression, where I found that avenue in hospice palliative care. And I literally felt like I was reborn. I mean, day by day, I was reborn. And it's interesting because when we talk about, and I don't take away, just don't get me wrong, I'm not taking away from other people's experiences with suicidal ideation, whatever, but this is just mine, right? I found that just by consequence, the suicidality, the suicidal ideation started to dilute as these practices, these avenues of who and what I was started to become, more expressive and more of who or what I was. And if you want to call that, Marcus, resiliency, then we can call it resiliency by all means, or anybody would like to call it resiliency. For me, it's a purest form of self-compassion. And it's so interesting now because wherever I'm teaching tonight at Ian Anderson House, which is a storied hospice, right? And this weekend we're at Seneca College, which is really exciting to teach hospice palliative care. Wherever I go, I bring it all back to that moment where I intersected with this incredible woman, June Caldwood, because I'm like, that's what I was feeling at that moment. She helped me to feel self-compassion, right? There's one thing, Dara and Marcus, is to feel compassion for somebody. It's quite another when they help you feel self-compassion. That's empowerment, right? Yeah. That's the definition of empowerment. You don't empower people. You help them to empower themselves. And that is pure trauma-informed care.
Yeah.
Amazing.
That was so accurately put. Thank you. Thanks for the summary. I'm glad that we're recording this.
Folks, like it all makes sense to me now at 51 years old. Even if I could just add a little bit more, just a little bit more context, I thought about reflecting back on my life. Is like, why did I rock climb and do dangerous things? Why do I still kind of twinge on that edge, in mountain biking and push the limit within? I mean, I have a child, I have a phenomenal career, I have an amazing partner. Why am I still on that edge? And I recognize there's still that seed of tension reducing behavior that hasn't been completely extinguished, that rides that edge at times. And unfortunately, I get hurt sometimes. But it keeps life interesting, that's for sure.
You're still an adrenaline junkie.
Sorry, Dara, I'm just going to jump in again. It just reminds me of a quote that I want to offer, and you'll know this quote from the words of Greg Irvine. So I am to care for my hands if I am to lift the fallen, my heart if I am to love the stranger, my mind if I am to cure the ill, my eyes if I am to find the lost, and my soul if I am to guide them home. That's all about self-care. So I think you're really touching on that self-care, and maybe your self-care is mountain biking or rock climbing. But I think the self-care piece, I'd really like to hear some of your thoughts about that from a worker's perspective, because our audience will be a lot of mental health workers and a lot of folks that are helping families and people in the community. So what about self-care? How is it important? Sure. How do you do it? What does it look like to you?
Yeah, absolutely, Marcus. I had the absolute privilege of listening and being in the presence of Dr. Irvine when I went down to Columbia University to study some of their narrative medicine program. If I may just shift that, I'm not quite a believer in the term self-care, right? Self-care can be anything from a bubble bath to a expensive fancy drink to shopping, what have you. I find sometimes self-care can actually be tension reducing behaviors that aren't the most productive. For example, I used to work at Dorothy Lay Hospice, and right across the street is the fancy mall Showy Gardens. So my self-care was spending sprees. I'd make good money as a director at Dorothy Lay Hospice, and I'd walk across the street and buy fancy clothes that I'd never wear and hang up. That was my self-care. And I recognized that it wasn't really a productive form of self-care, even though, many of us do it, because I'd have an empty bank account at the end of the month. So I shifted really from the concept of self-care, which also I share and teach now, to self-compassion. I think the aspects of self-compassion are more accurate. right? When you're talking about compassion, you're talking about feeling for another, whereas empathy is feeling into another, and sympathy is having put yourself in their position and feeling for yourself, right? So it's the most, actually, in many ways, destructive. Although Carlton cards or whatever, Hallmark cards are all sympathy cards. So if you look at self-compassion, calm, passion is Greek for feeling. Calm is to communicate the passion. It's to communicate feeling. Now, if you look at compassion and turn it on yourself, it's to feel for yourself. When I started to feel for myself, that happened through the principles of trauma-informed care and cultural humility. I acknowledged, I recognized, I felt for myself. I felt compassion for myself, you know? And interestingly, and this might sound, I don't know, to use a high school term, corny, okay? I actually started to love myself. I'm like, man, you're all right. You're okay. I like you. You know, sometimes when I'm riding, Dara, and I'm riding on my mountain bike, I'm like, you know, I actually say like, man, I love you. I love what you do. I love who you are. Right. So self-compassion is really where the root of all this is. So although I do all these activities, I take my kid roller skating, we go mountain climbing, rock climbing, whatever, mountain biking. Those aren't self-care practices. Those are still, as Dara mentioned, there's still a little bit of attention reducing due to traumatization. They're still there from that root of the trauma I experienced as a child and growing up into. There's a masculinity, at least I find that I'm toxified with, that I'm still struggling with that. But what really how I take care of myself, Marcus, number one is presence, aspects of reflection, journaling, introspection, trauma sensitive mindfulness, as Dr. Treleaven speaks to. It's like recognizing that if I'm in a mindfulness meditative state, which I practice quite a bit, I recognize what's coming forth from me, right? Because that starts my anxiousness, my need to move all starts to surface. I practice it throughout the day in moments of just standing still for 5 seconds before I enter a resident's room or enter a client's home, that I reflect and I feel, and I try to slow things down. That when I leave the hospice and I'm going to my car, I'm not rushing to get home. I'm just taking slow steps, intentional steps to change the environment, to adapt to a new environment, to change the smell. All these practices are what you would term as self-care, right? Not so much the doing of things. It's actually the presence and articulation of what's changing within me.
And Dara, if I might, I have another quick question. It's not a quick question because it's a big one, but the work that you've done at Lighthouse for Grieving Children. I can't remember what your title was, a diversity outreach person. So at Lighthouse, we were looking at diverse communities accessing why they're not accessing children's grief programs at the Lighthouse, and how different cultures and different communities grieve. And so I think that it aligns or is parallel to the work that we do with suicide prevention education, right? It's hard to break into, it's hard to talk about suicide in lots of cultures. The word suicide is not even in cultures sometimes. So I'm wondering, like, some of the challenges and what advice would you give to us who work in suicide prevention around, those intersections of culture and gender? How were you able to, I don't know if the right word is break through, but how did you get to different communities and be able to talk to them about children's grief? Maybe that's something that we could learn from that experience you've had in our work in suicide prevention.
Marcus, I don't think you could have asked a more perfect question. I mean, given my cultural background, we couldn't talk about suicide. You go to hell, right? You even talk about it, you're not strong, you're weak, and all these toxic kind of projections. I feel, I mean, it worked in the outreach we did with multiculturalism, and then it expanded to other measures of diversity, because we know that's not limited to multiculturalism. I think if we start looking at and identifying and acknowledging personal culture, I think if we look at the communities and the personal culture of peoples within those communities, and using the approach of a culturally humble approach where we ask them to share with us and teach us about how they live, how they view death, how they view suicidality, how they view, that's the important aspect of it. But if we're talking about individuals themselves, it's through personal culture, because through personal culture, we start to talk about what's affecting the suicidality or suicidal ideation, right? I would never, as a youngster, even in my 30s, talk about, although I thought about it all the time, every day, how to kill myself. I'd never talk about it, but I would tell you about my personal culture. I'd tell you about, where I felt aspects of my personal culture were being denigrated, were being dismissed, were being, and in that regard, if we look at it from that concept, I think that's a way or an approach to engage communities. Is we look at personal culture. We not necessarily teach, but receive from others and learn from others. How do they see life and death? How do they see aspects of, the things that I experienced in terms of traumatization? And you can even trace it back to, you folks would know this, intergenerational trauma, where, I've recognized a lot of the things I've experienced have nothing really to do with my current life situation, but have been passed down through DNA, through generations of war and genocide and what have you, and live within me. So I think, Marcus, just to make it, to make it a bit more concise, I think if we use the approach of culture humility, which is the teach me method, right, which is to receivership from these communities of who and what they are, and then from the individuals themselves to look at personal culture. Where do they feel like, we're from a generation well before pronouns and what have you, where we couldn't truly self-express. If we look at it from that personal culture piece, we could start to see, as depicted in the Kintsugi bowl, the cracks in the facades and the personas that we are projecting out as a result of however our families, chosen families and communities are infecting that.
And that's the Kintsugi bowl is another amazing teaching that you give around what is the imperfect, what's the art of precious scars.
That's right. It's an ancient Japanese practice I definitely will not appropriate, but that's an excellent depiction of everything we're talking about today. Here you have all these thousands of bowls that all look the same, and yet if they all break differently when they're broken, and if we choose to put them back together in the measurable intentionality of whatever you define as healing, they're going to have missing pieces. They're going to have different cracks. They're going to have pieces that don't fit. They might even not look like a bowl anymore, but it's mine, right? It's my expression. And then I paint the lines in gold, not to glorify or beautify trauma and suicidality and all these aspects of our humanity, but the fact that I can see it and see this is what's happened to me in my life. And if I want to show you, you say, hey, see the gold lines? That's me today. And if for people like ourselves who work in the field, we literally work through our bowls. We serve others through this broken bowl. So it's absolutely, it's a beautiful metaphor in that regard.
Thank you for sharing that. I saw that on your LinkedIn profile, and you've just brought it to full life for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Thank the Japanese culture for coming across that. It's actually quite accidental that it was birthed and then it turned into a beautiful philosophy that really intersects with everything we do in terms of social services, right? From suicide prevention to hospice palliative care to bereavement to caregiver support. It's a beautiful example of our living and dying.
Terrific. Dar, do you have any further questions or?
I can't top that. No.
The Kintsugi bowl is just.
And you're speaking at Seneca later. I'll be in the crowd.
I'd love it, Dar. You got such a great energy. I mean, I never thought anybody could match Marcus's energy, but you give him a run for his money. Can I share something quickly with you? I want to thank Andrew for behind the scenes, because I know all the work that it takes to do a podcast, Andrew. So thank you for that. But I want to share just something with you both. Just one second. So I was mountain biking a few weeks ago up in the Welland area. It was slushy, and I have what's called a fat tire bike, and it's just an inappropriate name. So big tire bike. And I love being on the land, as you're talking about, Marcus, and in nature and what have you. And I had this just overwhelming sense of peace and joy riding my bike on this beautiful land, which was an old golf course. So it intersects my worlds, you know, golf and mountain biking. And there was development happening. So they were going to develop the land, which is unfortunate. And I just happened to be crossing this section of unmarked path. And I don't know what brought me to attention to look down, right? I usually look straight ahead because I don't want to hit anything. I always look down. And right beside my tire was, I don't know, folks, if you can see this, was these antlers, right? See that? I literally wept. I was like, that's the earth given back to me. That's the earth showing me love. That's the earth saying, here, you're part of this. You're part of this land. I felt I was gifted something, you know, and I should I pick it up? Should I not? Should I pick it up or not? And it just spoke to me, said, take me home. This will show you that you are part of the whole. And so that was like a culmination of my entire life in this moment of being a part of this, being a part of the whole. You know, so much of our lives are felt, especially during COVID, and not as if we're done from COVID, but at least in my opinion, we felt separated and isolated and abandoned and what have you, which I felt a lot growing up. And I felt like, wow, this was like a message from somewhere, something that said, you're all right and you're part of the whole. So yeah, it was pretty cool. I put it in my backpack and I rode back to the parking lot, and the gentleman pulled up in a car. A guy pulled up in a car, and I said, uh-oh, maybe I was on private land. And he goes, hey, yo, man. I was like, yeah? He's like, what do you got there? I'm like, deer antlers? He's like, wow, that's awesome. You know, people spend their entire life trying to find that. I'm like, he was gifted to me today, man. Like, he's like, I said, you want it? He's like, no, I got lots of them. They're all over the land. They're in the spring, the deers, it falls off their heads, right? And it looks like you got a crown there. So yeah, honor that. I'm like, I already have, man. I already have. So every couple of days I sit and I rub it and I give it some love, and I feel the love from it. So thank you for that territorial acknowledgement, Marcus, because it really, really resonates in terms of, you know, what I'm experiencing.
Amazing. Rami, I just don't know how to thank you enough for being with us today and imparting some of your teachings and your experience and reframing some of the words that we have in the work that we do. I really do love the self-compassion thing. I think that's the message that we really want to get out to people around mental health and suicide ideation and trauma-informed care. So thank you, sir. It's a great pleasure to be on the other side of the interviewing process. Usually it's Rami interviewing me. So this is a good opportunity for us to shift roles. But again, thank you so much, and we really appreciate your time and your energy. And you are loved. Clearly, you are loved, and you give love. That's very important to the work that you do and to our friendship that we have.
Thank you, Marcus. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to bring this to a greater mass. And thank you, Dara and Andrew, for the platform.
Thank you again. I'll echo everything Marcus said. And your tagline at one point, you said, it's an honor, a privilege, and a mystery, and with humility that you do your job, and you brought that to the screen today.
Oh, I'm glad, Dara. I mean, when you live it and breathe it, you know, if anybody were to ask me what's my personal culture, I'm saying, this is it, right? Yeah. not all these other things that are projected onto me. This is it. So it's easy to talk about it when you live and breathe it and love it.
It is your calling. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Dara.
Thank you so much.